Hey everyone, hope it's going well. John here. Just wanted to give you a bit of a breakdown of my latest track. I've been wanting to do one of these deconstructed videos for a long time, but finding the time, etc., is always hard. So kind of just whipped up a quick setup here and show you some things. And if you've got any questions about things you want to learn more about, put them down in the comments, and hopefully I will be able to address them in a future video. So my latest track is called CYCLE-0x1C6. Having a bit of fun with the hex naming conventions again. We'll probably be doing that for some tracks. And rather than play it here, I suggest that you go listen to it first if you haven't already. We're going to hear bits of it in this video. But I kind of wanted to give you a bit of the step-by-step. So whereas with the last few tracks I've done, I've been using a program called Helio, which is a MIDI sequencer. And if I go something like this, you'll see this is Helio. So this looks more like your piano roll, but it's for like MIDI sequencing, and you can send that MIDI over to another program, for example to Bespoke Synth, which I use essentially as a plugin host with some effects at the moment. While I do really like that, I find using a piano roll type sequencer is better for chords, or better, let's say easier in some ways. I still have not been able to overcome MIDI latency issues that happen when you're doing kind of MIDI transmission from within a computer. Always had issues with that, never found a way to kind of fix that. Feel free to let me know if you found a way in the comments. But so for this track, I wanted to go back to using my current favorite tracker, which is OpenMPT. And while you can also do MIDI transmission with this, and I have done that in previous tracks, I wanted to go back to straight using samples. That way there's absolutely no issues with timing, everything can be kept tight. Which is weird to say for an ambient track like this, but it's kind of nice to know that things are going to make sounds when you've kind of programmed them to make sounds. So this is, this track, this CYCLE-0x1C6 track, how it sounds within OpenMPT. The end result's normalized, louder. It's also got some additional effects that we'll talk about. But if we kind of go back to the start of the workflow for this track, it's actually worth talking about the samples themselves. So you see we've got a few samples here: pad, glass alf, tonal mini pluck, pad vox protocol, ambience red noise. So these are samples that I have also synthesized and released the project files for, and that's part of my Mech Sounds pack, which you can download yourself by, at the moment the best way is just any track that uses them has, on my website, has this section, samples used, Mech Sounds. You just click on that, and then you can just download all the Mech Sounds, all the sound samples that I've made here. I've got information about the different tools that I use to make these sounds, if you haven't already looked at it. And what you'll find in there is you've got the samples pack, and then you've also got inside there, you've got project files. And then so you can just, if you find a sample that you like, and these are all public domain MIT, so you can do whatever you want with them, use them wherever you want. But if you do really like the sound of one and you're interested in how I made that, you can actually find the project files for them in there as well. And as you'll see, all the software that I've used to make these sounds are all open source, no cost software as well. As with everything, I'm trying to do that so basically finances is not a barrier to going in and exploring and learning. So these samples that are in this have all been made, and they're all part of that Mech Sounds pack. So ambient red noise, which actually I don't think even made it into the final export now that I talking about it, I was experimenting with having some kind of white or red noise ambience in the background, but I in the end decided to remove that and keep it as like minimal as possible. But you know, we have this sound. We've got, you know, so that was the glass elf. We've got a mini pluck. What's this? Vox protocol. Sorry, that's quite loud. I'll see if I can lower the volume in post, but we'll see. These sounds for this track, I was actually using a tool called Vitalium, which is, if you've used Vital, this is just that. It's just Mr. Titel, I think, however you say his name, who made Vital, was very kind to release, I don't believe it's the latest version, but an earlier version as open source. However, to actually download it through, you know, the website, you still have to sign up. And so for like a more true, pure, whatever open source experience, someone had forked that and called it Vitalium, rebranded it so it's not infringing on the original creator's rights. It's essentially Vital, and it has all the features that I'm personally interested in. So I totally recommend checking this out. The thing I'm most interested in with this synth is, so it's a wavetable synth if you haven't seen it, but you can actually create your own wavetables just through basically harmonic editing through these keyframes. So what you'll see in this top wave here, if I just play one of these keys, it's that kind of glassy sound. So I made that just through, basically one keyframe in the wavetable is actually nothing, it's silence. And then the other is this, you can see this kind of wavy wave, and I played with the harmonics here to kind of get it to a sound that I like. And then once you've set up those keyframes, that's actually just this frame slider here. So which means that not only can you, you can do harmonic design and transforming harmonic design, which is fantastic. I love it. It's essentially additive synthesis, but you get to kind of sculpt the sound yourself. You can also, I believe, if you click and drag in this top part, you can actually kind of draw the wave as well. So, and then it just kind of changes the bottom wave. You can increase the grid size, so you can, do something more precise. I think it goes, 16 to 16 is the biggest you can do, but you can do something fairly specific here if you want. But I'll just get out of that and reset that. So yeah, we've got that that wavetable that I created just through putting in keyframing the harmonics there. So that's what that sounds like. And then that's just using an LFO to kind of swing back and forth on that frame slider there. And then I also added a second kind of 1 octave pitch down oscillator there that's also doing something. It doesn't go from silence, it just goes from a normal sine wave to a kind of a bit more of a complex sine wave there with some more overtones. And you may or may not be able to hear that there. So that's how I created that glass Alf sound specifically. And then also I've tried to name the presets the same as the export sound that's in the Mech Sounds sound pack. So the Vox protocol one. So you can actually use these if you prefer the more synthesizer route rather than using the samples, then these are available as well. And then maybe mini pluck, I didn't give the same naming convention. but it's kind of a simple, basic kind of pluck. So yeah, so I've essentially created those in Vitalium, just using Bespoke Synth as my plugin host there, and then I bring them into OpenMPT, and I do my normalization in here, and kind of just cut off silence at the start and fade out at the end, and then I re-export these. These are the final mix sounds ones that you get, and then I use OpenMPT to sequence it basically. Now I might spend a little bit of time excuse me, I might spend a little bit of time on OpenMPT, because I know someone in my comments previously said that it can be quite tricky to work out, and I will agree with you. OpenMPT, a lot of tracker software, and OpenMPT in particular, can look quite daunting at first, especially because I think one thing that I know put me off originally, and I've since learned better, is that because the style of it kind of looks like a Windows 95 program, you assume that it's kind of old and archaic and it can't do much. That's very wrong. There are definite limitations if you think in terms of modern commercial DAWs. For example, VST plugins are not really supported in it, and so it's much better for use with samples, which is kind of the true tracker way, quote unquote. But you can actually use it as a MIDI sequencer as well and send that MIDI to a different program, which, as I said, I've done before. So, but I won't go too deep into tracker logic, but the very brief is that basically each one of these columns that you see, that is, I usually set that up to be a particular instrument. Technically that one is pointing to a specific instrument, which is that one. So you can actually have, if I had another note here, that could be 2. So that would actually be G4 playing on instrument 1 and then G4 playing on instrument 2. And that would probably, depending how you've got it set up, cut off that note on instrument 1. So I don't usually do that. You could probably do it for if you're making like complextro or something that switches instruments a lot. But just to try and keep my head less cluttered, I try to keep it, one instrument per column, and because then you can basically, set volume settings for that whole column, that whole instrument, and your panning, and give them names and stuff like that. So I open those settings just through the middle click on my mouse, but you can also right click and go channel settings. So with a lot of trackers, you kind of set up a pattern, and then you can see up the top here I've got my patterns 0 through to 6. So it's essentially just sequencing those different samples, those different instruments. You have the in OpenMPT, you kind of have your sample as the kind of foundational level, but then you can kind of encapsulate that in what's called an instrument. So in this samples tab up here, here's the pure samples. But if you're using instruments, which, like I said, let's kind of think of it as a wrapper around a sample. This is where you can set things like volume, pitch, and other envelopes. So for Vox protocol here, so that's number 3, instrument 3. Let's just go to where instrument 3 is used. So here you can see instrument 3 is used in these 3 columns. So if I just mute the other instruments by clicking on them just regularly, and I'm just going to right click on this pattern and lock playback to selection just to loop this pattern. Hopefully you can see how that's actually following this volume envelope a bit more, and it's fading in and then fading out. That's that helps kind of automate some of the kind of fades and stuff like that that you would otherwise have to do manually with the tracker by using an effects road. I think I usually get to it by double clicking, and then you can set volume and then change that in each step, etc., etc. So that's quite handy. You can also, another thing I use quite often in here is you can add some random panning variation. You can also do, volume randomness, cutoff randomness. You can set like a low pass or a high pass filter here. Channel default usually goes to low pass, which I do actually have on this. A few words on that. I think I've said previously I don't like using random in my tracks because I basically like the sound that people hear to be exactly specified, so that if they explore the project files, what they're discovering is actually true to the sound they're hearing, kind of thing. The only time I break that rule for myself is usually random panning, just because it's such a quick way just to get a slightly wider sound. So I'll admit that, sorry everyone, but here's how you do it, and at least you can see here that it's kind of random. So you can make that very extreme or not. So I'll just leave that there. But if we take off the cutoff, for example, so what I'll do is I'll take off the cutoff, I'll take off the volume envelope, and you can hear how this instrument changes. So that's with no filter. So as you can hear, there was still a bit of a fade because that's in the actual wave sample itself, but it was a lot steeper kind of fade in. And it lasted a lot longer as well. So the other thing to understand with kind of samples versus instruments is that samples are kind of the playback speed and pitch is tied to different notes. So, if I press, this is going to be really loud. If let's just make a new, let's just make a new pattern for this. I know why that's not making sound, is because my global volume is currently set to 0, which I will explain more about that in a moment, but I'm glad you got to see that. Let's just, for the purposes of this, automate that back to full. There you go. And we'll just play back to selection. So what you're hearing here, C5, is just your regular, that's just playing the sample back regularly. Now if we increase the pitch or the octave on this, which I'm going to do with some shortcuts, which you can set up yourself. So it's a little subtle now, but if in case you haven't worked with samples like this before, as you increase the pitch, it basically plays back faster, and as you decrease the pitch, it'll play back slower. So if I go up an octave, I'm just going to make this pattern shorter so we can loop it more. Pattern properties, let's just make it 16. Yeah, so as you can hear, it's playback shorter as well as high pitch, whereas if we go down a couple octaves, you'll see how much longer it takes. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because whereas that timing will change with sample, that timing will not change with your instrument envelopes. So if I turn back on my volume envelope here, as well as the filter. So that's the speed it's using that volume envelope. And if I increase that pitch by a few octaves, so it's probably sounding shorter because the sample was actually ending halfway there, but it's having that same fade in. Point I'm trying to make is the instrument volume automation envelopes not affected by the note you use, whereas samples does affect the speed. And they're both good for different cases, and I usually use them both in different cases. So yeah, that's basically to understand how to use OpenMPT. You set up samples. If you want, you can wrap them in instruments, and then what you're sequencing in here are those instruments or samples if you're not using instruments. As I said, you can also apply effects, volume, panning. You can also do like stutter kind of stuff, re-triggering notes. You can do that really quickly. One reason trackers are often used for breakbeat music and other kind of fast music where you have chopped up loops and stuff like that is because you can very, very quickly sequence those loops to re-trigger at different points in different ways, different pitches. And so it's worth looking at people using, for example, renoise is used a lot as a commercial option. But you can do most of the same things in OpenMPT and some other trackers. The only automation that I'm using in this track, we'll just remove that last pattern, is you can see in the last column here is global volume. And so I've literally just done that. It goes from 0 to 80 being the top value for this kind of automation. That's literally just setting the volume of the master bus, essentially, the global volume. That's just for a fade in. Let me unscale it. And then fade out at the end. So in your general tab here, this is where you set things like your tempo, initial tempo they're calling it, because you can also automate that tempo. Global volume, 128 being the maximum. That 128 here equals 80 in these numbers. And I believe that's because these use hexadecimal, whereas this is your decibel number. Also, just a heads up, so I'm using Linux Mint here, whereas OpenMPT is originally for Windows. They've actually put a lot of work to have it work well in Wine, which is the kind of Windows emulation software. That does mean occasionally you'll get weird glitches. It's not doing it now, where one of these columns will disappear. Yeah, like that. Just click in it again, it'll come back. There's a few small things here that will happen. I'll be honest, OpenMPT, after working on a long session, may just crash on Linux Mint. So I save pretty regularly. However, the workflow of using it, I found, is once you get used to it, is for me worth it. I actually use OpenMPT on a lot of my my professional work now. So you would have heard or seen some music from some of the games on my YouTube channel, but some of the games I'm working on at the moment, I'm using OpenMPT for everything. I love working in it. Especially for that slightly retro flavor, because you're working with samples rather than synthesizers. It makes me feel like I have a lot of control over the sound, which I quite like. So you also have in here, you've got your different channels, which you can also name here and set some examples here. You'll see we've got plugin effects. That works. So OpenMPT does actually ship with some inbuilt, sort of inbuilt effects. I'll quickly show you, but probably spend time experimenting with this yourself just to kind of understand it. What you have to do is you kind of have like an effects rack here, and you go select And then, so it ships with these DirectX effects, which funnily enough actually work on Linux. And so you've got, for example, a reverb, waves reverb, and then echo, which is your echo delay. Those are the two that I tend to use. So you double click on that and it puts it in that slot. Then you click editor. And then, you know, you can set your effects here. So if I keep playing this, that hasn't changed anything. So that's good. This is probably what you'd find while you're working on it. So nothing's actually going to this effects yet. And what you want to do to set things to go to waves reverb is you can either basically send an instrument to it. You can instrument column, let's say, and columns and trackers are called channels. So you can set each channel to one effect. So I could just do channel 1, which would just be this first column here. Or while I've got this effect selected, I can click master, and that'll send everything to it. So if I press play again, maybe halfway through, yeah, so hopefully you can hear that. So that's how you set effects. And then, you know, when you're happy, when you're done, file, stream, export. Most of this you can usually keep the same. I always do normalize output. In the limit top right, that's where you can kind of set whether if you don't want the whole song, you can set seconds or sequences or whatever. But yeah, whole song, and then okay, and then you'll just save it somewhere. So that's probably all that's worth showing you in OpenMPT today. There's a lot more you can do with it. Probably the only other thing worth seeing is, for now, is if you go to View Setup, this is where you have a whole lot of customization options, including, you know, how it works with Wine if you're using Linux. You know, MIDI for MIDI output. Probably the one that's worth seeing is keyboard. And this is where, you know, you can see pretty much every action that's used, and you can set new shortcuts for it, which is very, very handy for using trackers. So the default keys it came with, you know, they're fine, probably work for a lot of people. I had kind of started getting used to certain keys I had set up in other trackers before. And so I think for, you know, my pitch up, pitch down, and then octave up, octave down, I have like hold control, and then there's a few keys on the keyboard that are next to each other that, to me, it just makes kind of more intuitive sense. So set all that up, and then you can start making things really quickly. You can also, I've set the tab key and Q to kind of quickly go to previous and next sequence. Or pattern, sorry, and you know, you can set up more things like that, and you can start moving around the song very quickly. Excuse me. So that's OpenMPT, and so for this song, you know, as you can hear, it's very similar to the final output, but you may have noticed that the final output had a bit more echo on it. And that's because I took that final output and I've put it through a new program that I'm working on, which at this stage is probably nothing much to talk about, but the plan is to keep building it out as I make tracks, and hopefully it becomes more and more useful with time. So I'll just show you what it looks like. So this is what I'm calling the Floral Sample Toolkit. Floral is kind of, let's say, brand that I'm using on a lot of my like software tools. I just like the aesthetic of it, basically, and it helps kind of give them a bit of consistency. You basically load a wave. So I'm going to click load wave, and then I'm going to load a file. So I've just cut out loading that file. But yeah, I mean, you can see my file path here. There's nothing really to hide there. And basically each step you take in this floral sample toolkit, it'll print it to the trace console down here with the step number, so 00 is loading the file. What I'll just do is I will show you exactly what I did, and then I'll explain this a bit more. So I've loaded the algorithm. I've loaded the wave. I'm going to choose one of the algorithms. In this case, it was Stutter Phantom. I'm going to click Process, Audio Processed, and then if I go Preview, it's going to play the result. Don't have a stop button yet, so we just go close and reopen it. But basically what happens is, once you've processed it, you can actually then export that wave and trace. And so you click on that, you save it to a new wave, and then it'll open up a second dialog and save a trace that you save as a text file. And that'll just save everything that's in this trace console here. And the reason for that is because unlike other project files like this, which are essentially non-destructive, this is, because it's changing the individual samples in the wave file, this is destructive. And as more complex algorithms happen, I didn't want to be limited by non-destructive methods, but I still wanted to make it as open source as possible so you could kind of understand each step that I'm taking. And that's where this trace console comes in. So basically, I'll open up now the trace console export that came from this, and you'll see what I mean. Also, I'm sure someone's going to ask me about this. This is a really cool launcher called Kando, which I've just mapped to my control spacebar, and then you create all your own shortcuts. And then, so you can just sort of file explorer. You can do things quickly. You can get pretty advanced with it, but that's for someone else to make a video about. So what you can see here is the trace export that was exported from the toolkit. So even though it is a destructive process and you can't just open the project file, it tells you step by step exactly what I did, so you can recreate it yourself. I loaded up the file that came out of OpenMPT. I processed using the algorithm 3 Stutter Phantom. I exported the wave to this file. I exported the trace to this file, and then this trace is saved in the actual folder that I've shared on my website as well. So, so if you go to my website, you go to this track, you download the project, you'll get a folder that is very similar to this. Shows you my steps. And so any future track I use this on, you'll be able to see exactly what algorithm I used in here. So for those who are interested in what I'm building here, I've pretty much shown you the basics, but the actual technical side. So this is being built in a framework called Tori, which uses JavaScript or TypeScript or similar as your front end, and then you can use Rust as the back end for more complex, especially if you're doing real-time audio, etc., etc. However, I discovered that JavaScript has what's called the Web Audio API, which actually lets you do sample level editing, especially if it's not non-real-time, but you can do audio processing real-time. And I'm basically just trying to teach myself JavaScript first. So all the front end is done in HTML plus JavaScript plus CSS, and then the actual audio sample editing is also done in JavaScript. And this is also open source, so you can find that on my website by going open source tooling and then clicking Floral Sample Toolkit, and that'll open the Codeberg, the repository for it. So feel free to pull it down. This is MIT, fork it, extend it, do whatever you want with it. I don't know if I'm going to be taking requests or commits to this repo at this stage. Maybe eventually, but I know at least I'm just going to keep building it and using it in my tracks, and then, you know, if someone else wants to kind of turn it into a polished app themselves, they're more than welcome to. You can do whatever you want with the code. So yeah, and the reason I'm using the Tori framework is because you can basically use JavaScript, Rust, etc., as I said, and then rather than it being a web app that you need to go to a website to use, you can compile it to an actual desktop app. And that means, you know, so if you go here and go to releases, I currently only have the .deb compiled version of the app, just because that works on the version of Linux that I'm using. But, you know, if you're not bad with code, you can take this code, Tori is also completely free, open source, etc. You can compile it yourself for your own operating system, and so then you can run it not within the Visual Studio Code or whatever. You can just run the binary of it. So yeah, that's how I made this last track of mine, CYCLE-0x1C6. Just to recap, I used Vitalium to make the sounds using kind of harmonic design with keyframes. Very fun stuff there. Those sounds went into the Mech Sounds pack, which you can download, but they also I went straight into OpenMPT, sequenced with OpenMPT with minimal automation, but, you know, a little bit here and there using the instrument functions and the global volume. Exported that wave, put that into the current state of my Floral sample toolkit, used the stutter phantom algorithm, processed it, exported it, gave it that bit of kind of surreal echo, and then that's the final version you hear. So hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got, like I said, any questions, put them down in the comments. You know, I continuously want to make these videos more often, but it's always hard balancing time between actually making the music and the software for the music and the videos, as well as other jobs and incomes, etc., etc. I'm sure you understand. You guys have a great time, and I'll see you next time.